Thank you, Mohit. Well, I will start with saying that Peter has actually set the right context for what I'm going to say. In particular, some of the kind of narratives that permeate Pakistani mindset regarding both militancy and extremism, and its genesis in the country as well. So, I'm at USIP for the past few months. What I have been doing is looking at some of these issues, and in particular, what has been the policy response of the Pakistani government and the various sections of the state. And my primary focus when I started my work was on the key policy document, the NISP, the Internal Security Policy, which was approved almost a year ago and has been under implementation since then. But then this unfortunate Peshawar attack took place, and that also, gave me some more insights into the kind of responses we are now seeing in Pakistan, both by the people as well as the state. And surely, as Mohit mentioned at the start of this debate, that never has Pakistan appeared so determined and clear in fighting and combating the various manifestations of terrorism as it is perhaps now. And some of what the data that Peter showed us kind of confirms that. Particularly the trends in not negotiating with the terrorists, in taking firm and clear action against them. So in this context, what is also important is to remember that Pakistan's internal security is actually driven and linked to its perception of its external insecurity. Pakistan has been an insecure state, since 1947, and it has that narrative, which is the official state-sponsored thesis about Pakistan's existence, that it came into being as an anomaly to India, and India would be willing to dismember it or harm it or break it or lord over its decline. And sadly, 1971, that whole prophecy was partly fulfilled. It was not solely India's doing, because Pakistani policies were much to be accounted for. But Indian intervention in 1971 to support the Bengali nationalism and the creation of Bangladesh has left a deep scar on the security framework of Pakistan and how the military views Pakistan's security. And that is what matters at the end of the day. And in that context, the India-centric security view then drives how the internal security has to be managed. And in part, this whole narrative of external forces at work, whether they are Indians or whether they are later in the more recently the Americans, is a kind of a national belief system. And it is very difficult to challenge that and undo that. It would require decades of very hard work, because that is what the Pakistani textbooks state, that is what the military doctrines say, that is what an ordinary Pakistani, you ask them and they would kind of confirm that India is the enemy and we are threatened, and therefore all militias that target India or vow to target India are sort of kosher. And that is where the problem of larger internal security emerges, because if you have certain militias which are directed towards India and have direct or indirect support of the state, then it is very difficult to tackle the other militias that have emerged in the recent decades against the Pakistani state. And TTP is a prime example of that offshoot of the jihad infrastructure that has been in place for nearly 3 decades now. I'll quickly go to the policy sort of documents and frameworks that guide the counterterrorism operations now. And it's also amazing that the issue of terrorism and civilian deaths and horrific bomb blasts is not new. Only in last 5 years, 1,000 schools were blown up by the Taliban, and that's data compiled by the Human Rights Watch. Over 50 Sufi shrines have been targeted in the last 6 years. There have been ghastly incidents against women and kids in Peshawar, in Lahore, in other parts, in Quetta, where civilians have been targeted. But the Peshawar school, with that mass scale of brutal murder of kids, changed the narrative, and more so because it was an army school, and a lot of kids there had relationships with the military officials. Either they were directly kids or somehow linked to that. So I think finally the realization dawned in the Pakistani policymakers that they have to do something and stand clear and appear to be firm and clear-headed with view to the militancy challenge. The National Internal Security Policy was drafted last year in 2013, and it was formally approved almost a year ago by the federal cabinet, and since then it has been under implementation. And it is also ironic that the previous civilian government did not even come up with a comprehensive policy document which would tackle the challenge of internal security. The approach was to outsource the whole range of security matters to the military, whether it was external or internal. And with the election in 2013, which sent Mr. Nawaz Sharif to the PM House with a thumping majority, was a kind of beginning of a civilian assertion. And Mr. Sharif, before this policy, also tried to change the way Pakistan's internal security was being managed, and he created a new body at the cabinet level, which would deal with the security matters, and which would be chaired by the PM, comprising all the military chiefs and the intelligence heads. And later on, this policy document came into being, but somehow, after its launch, the government did not show the kind of commitment through resources and the necessary institutional measures that were required to implement that. And in particular, in the budget of 2013 and 14 financial year, there was no allocation whatsoever for these special purpose counterterrorism operations. And so the NISP remained kind of a resource-starved policy framework for a long time until this Peshawar incident. And now with the announcement of the National Action Plan, there has been a firm declaration by the government which intends to provide more resources to implement some of the key measures outlined in the second iteration of the security policy, which is known as the National Action Plan, or NAP. It is a 20-point agenda which was announced by the Prime Minister. Almost 17 or 18 points are a regurgitation of the NISP that was earlier in place, except two key items. One is the establishment of the military courts, and the second is the reintroduction of capital punishment to create deterrence and to demonstrate that the state is serious about punishing those who perpetrate terrorism. And thus far, I think over 20 convicted terrorists have been hanged, and hundreds are supposed to be hanged in the current year. I think we'll see more of that. That's partly has to do with the kind of public mood, the kind of national opinion on vengeance and immediate action, and there's a very split view on that, whether it's going to actually lead to achievement of objectives under NAP. Similarly, there's a 21st constitutional amendment that was enacted by the Parliament in early January. That amends both the Army Act and the Constitution and sets up military courts for speedy justice. The narrative in Pakistan, which was also kind of changed after Peshawar, was that the failure of the judicial system was somehow the key cause for the rise of militancy and terror in Pakistan. And that is partly true as well, because Pakistan's courts are unable, for various reasons, for a very weak prosecutorial system, for problems with police investigation, and the security of judges and witnesses, that only 2 to 3% of those charged with terrorism are actually punished or convicted. The rest are either set free or languish in jails, or there are jailbreaks. As you've seen, there have been 2 or 3 major jailbreaks, releasing hundreds of militants by force. And the NAP sort of addresses that, and there has been, in the past 2 weeks, immense progress on that, particularly in the province of Punjab, where for the first time in almost a decade, the militant infrastructure in terms of seminaries, training camps, hate literature, and publishing hate material have been cracked down. Dozens of clerics who preach hatred have been arrested. These are new developments in Pakistan. We have been articulating that for almost a decade now, saying do this, and finally it seems that it is happening. But there's a problem here. The problem is that the civilian government is in place. It tried to take charge of security. It tried to rearrange the security architecture. But it seems that either it has admitted to its failure, or that the military has assumed the driving seat position, and so the army chief appears to be taking the lead, which is okay with Pakistani public opinion, by the way, because the civilian governments and political parties are either viewed as weak or soft on the terrorists, because they have been, they had been advocating for a compromise with the Pakistani Taliban for long. And secondly, that the paradox of Pakistan is that the military is viewed as the only viable institution that can deliver results, while a lot of its security worldview is also paradoxically responsible for some of the mess that we are in today. And that is a kind of a paradox which has continued for decades, and it's an unresolved one, and we'll see how this transforms. The second problem with the implementation of the National Action Plan is that Pakistani constitution in the recent years has also undergone major shifts through constitutional amendments which have empowered the provinces, and it is no longer the kind of centralized state that Pakistan, say, 10 or 20 years ago was. Over 110 functions purely belonging to the federal government were devolved to the provinces in 2010, 2011, and 2012. The finances, the federal taxes, the bulk of share goes to the provinces, and a lot of de-radicalization measures, whether they have to do with changing of narratives, improvement of education system, police reform, local government reform, are purely provincial domains. And the provinces have not been on board in both the formulation of NISP and, to a great degree, the National Action Plan. Although the National Action Plan came through a consensus by the political parties, but it was a kind of a centralized process, which was then told to the provinces that you have to implement it. How far they own it, how far they're going to put in their own money, remains to be seen. And in the provincial management of internal security, there's also a dichotomy that is emerging, which is that while the chief minister of a province is in charge of the home affair, the internal security affairs, the police, the intelligence, civilian intelligence operations, the so-called apex committees, which are coordinating the implementation of National Action Plan, are being led by the army chief. So in January, there were two meetings held in the Punjab and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa provinces, where the army chief was leading these meetings, and the chief ministers, who are elected and in charge, constitutionally mandated with the various functions they have to deliver, were there as participants or senior distinguished participants or panelists. So there's a bit of a anomaly there, and because you have a civilian government, you have a democratic order, but in effect it is the military which is in the driving seat and implementing the National Action Plan. I think that the third issue that is going to impact the implementation of these counterterrorism measures and these policy frameworks. And by the way, these policy frameworks are just fine. I mean, there can be problems with certain formulation or certain definitions, but by and large, they address all the areas. They talk about de-radicalization, they talk about madrasas, they talk about mosque reforms, they talk about education improvement, change in curricula, police reforms, prosecution reforms. So, there's a whole laundry list which is there. So one cannot have pick much bone with these plans. But the real question is whether these plans are owned by the provincial administrations, whether they're going to give the resources, whether they feel empowered enough to implement that, or see that as a centralized dicta by the federal government and the military in particular. And more importantly, whether the external security parameters which define Pakistan's view of its insecurity are going to change, and these are in summary related to the India and Afghanistan policy. On Afghanistan, we do see a shift with the military making a very direct effort to engage with the new Afghan government in building confidence, in seeking their support to eliminate the TTP hideouts. But on India, it's all stalled. It is stalled. The diplomatic engagement broke down in August 2014. Since then, there have been no public, official, diplomatic talks of any level, of any kind. Secondly, the Indian Prime Minister has also, to appease his own constituency, has taken a hard line on Pakistan. And Indian public opinion also does not seem very interested in engaging with Pakistan. And in Pakistan, that there are very few advocates who really want the India policy to change. So that's the dilemma that is going to impact, because if the private militias that act as arms of Pakistan's security policy towards India remain in place, they are going to support laterally or covertly the jihad infrastructure. And Pakistan's action plan against terrorism cannot succeed if the jihad infrastructure is not unpacked, undone, and morphed into something different. And one last minute, Mohit, sorry for the stepping over my time. And so this particular dilemma pervades the larger internal security debate. I think one final point that has to be made is that the overt or the over emphasis on the Taliban, whether they're Afghan or they're Pakistan or the India-centric militias, is well known here in Washington and elsewhere. But actually, the crux of the internal security challenge now is sectarian outfits that have grown in number, in their power, in their outreach, and that are largely based out of Punjab, but have now, found new sanctuaries in Sindh province, in Balochistan for various reasons. And they provide not just the foot soldiers to the Pakistani Taliban, but also drive the ideological agenda of the larger, Sunni extremism in country, and that requires a far more complex and delicate strategy to deal with, and that is still largely unaddressed, because crackdowns are easy. You can go and arrest 500 clerics, shut down a few dozen madrasas and mosques, confiscate hate materials. But what do you do? What do you do next? For that, you have to have a larger internal discourse within Pakistani society and within the Islamic theological parameters, and look at sources within Islam that promote harmony and tolerance. Because at the moment, it's a kind of a hotbed, a time bomb that is ticking. And what needs to be done? Well, basically, I think. There are three issues here. The National NACTA, which is the National Anti-Terror Counter-Terrorism Authority, is the leading, or a Pakistani version of Homeland Security, is the driver of these counter-terrorism measures. Thus far, it has not been funded. Despite so many years, it has a very thin staffing expertise, and many of the functions it is supposed to perform, and most importantly of intelligence coordination between civil and military, remain unimplemented. And the Prime Minister is the leader of that. The NACTA did not even meet for a whole year until this Peshawar tragedy happened, and then the Prime Minister gave the orders for its board to meet. So it has to be given the due importance. If you look at the example of Sri Lanka, which combated private militias fighting the state, there was a far more engagement by the office of the Prime Minister in leading the operations. The second is resourcing, which I've already mentioned, and the third then comes to the kind of institutional arrangements that you need. And for that, without effective police reforms and local government reform and education reform, all these action plans would not have long-term impact